And you mentioned Latin America, of course. There we've seen probably one of the few places where inequality, income inequality at least, seems to be falling in the last decade or so.
It has, yes.
And if one regards that as clearly from a very high level, so it was. So if one regards that as an example of where things are moving in a reverse direction from elsewhere, are there other examples you can think of periods or places where we've had as it were, a benign movement in the right direction in terms of reducing.
Well, I think you have the one thing about Latin America, though, that it had very high levels of inequality. Yep. And therefore that made it easier to come down.
Exactly.
But I think South Korea had quite a long stretch of growth without inequality going up, not going very much down either, but since it was not very unequal anyway. It depends on, if you're looking at the very rich, you find extremely high differences. In India, oddity, in terms of income inequality, it does not look that general indicators like Gini don't indicate as if it's a terribly unequal society. But if you look at specific provisions like education, like healthcare, then you see the tremendous inequality. China almost the opposite of that, in the sense the income distributional inequalities are much greater than in India. On the other hand, the educational inequalities, while they are still present, are far less, and healthcare inequalities are far less. Of course, if you bring in such issues as liberty and democratic issues and human rights, then there's another basket of problems to look at. But just looking at those criteria on which the human development movement has tended to focus, I think you get a kind of contrast, higher income inequality in China, much higher facilities inequality, including education and healthcare, which are really very central in India. So I think we have to see how to change it. I mean, I had the opportunity of spending a bit of time with Brazil, and had earlier been to Mexico. I think one of the things that's particularly in the context of Brazil, which I did look into this, I mean, there have been systematic efforts in making the country less unequal. That doesn't mean that there is no great inequality. Of course there is. There is enormous difference between the very poor and the very rich. On the other hand, there has been a real engagement, and people have sown as they, people have reaped as they had sown, which is, you know, should not be that surprising.
So you mentioned, I mean, the difference in India and China. Does that mean that China, as it were, is more mobile in the sense of terms of more equality of opportunity, or in the sense you said education, for example, was distributed?
Well, it's certainly mobile in some ways there, because I think because the Chinese educational expansion and very elementary healthcare expansion began well before the reforms. There's a much longer history of a massive education. I mean, that actually there were a lot of terrible things that happened in the earlier period, including the Great Leap Forward, the famines that followed, including the oddities and the failures of the Cultural Revolution. But the fact is that also in this period, pretty much everyone had a kind of basic literacy. Yes. But the quality had now been dramatically improved. It hadn't got quite as far as the highest performers like Korea or Japan would. Even though some of the Chinese cities, the quality is very high indeed. So I think you find a situation where people have been, it's been easy for them to come away from the, you know, the kind of forced poverty of not having gainful employment that could generate high wages to one in which they can. And you see that if you look at the manufacturing world in the world, across the globe, you'll find a huge number of commodities are now manufactured in China. Almost anything I pick up, whether it's a pencil sharpener, or a computer, or a watch, or a pulse meter. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, I'm surrounded by these things made in China. And that's how mobility occupational, of course, in a way that it hasn't happened in India. Of course, the mobility that has happened in India, a lot of people getting education, getting into the IT sector, and so on, and to some extent it's happened in chemical and medical, pharmaceutical world too. But I think there's a lot more occupational mobility needed in many of the countries. On top of that, regional mobility, because in China has the advantage that it doesn't have as many languages as Indians do, which is a bit of a barrier. It's not a barrier at a higher level, at a lower level could be, but it need not be, of course traditionally Indians have moved from one part to the other, Bihari labor, from Punjab agriculture and so on. This has been a feature, and even though there are a certain amount of tension generated or connected with that, most recently involving Gujarat and Bihar, I think. But I think the opportunity of regional mobility is quite high. In China, there is a tendency towards that too. On the other hand, this is of course heavily controlled. You don't need anyone's permission in India to go from one end of the country to the other. Whereas in China, that's not an easy thing. So to a great extent, this has become a part of bureaucratic control. And among the things that China has to look at is whether these bureaucratic controls are productive or counterproductive in generating a prosperous, united country or not. It's not that China doesn't have any problems, it has lots of problems, but it does not have some of the problems that India has. I think that these distinctions, and similarly Brazil doesn't. You see, when Jean Drèze and I in 1989 wrote a book, or published a book in 1989 called Hunger and Public Action, Brazil was a country we often refer to as having a lot of income and not doing much with it. And there were low in human development indicators. On the other hand, this was before 89, was before Mahboub's 1990 report, but what later became the human development criteria, we were using that obviously in that book. And Brazil was a very low performer. By now, actually, in the book that Jean Drèze and I are now doing over this year, I hope to finish by the end of the year, the calendar year, Brazil appears as a complete contrast to the other end, as how many different things it has succeeded in doing. And sometimes people don't quite understand. There's a very big distinction. A lot of people in India refer to Brazil, saying that there are lots of things that are done through private opportunity. But the fact is that come, like in Kerala medicine, Kerala education, come on the basis of solid support by the state. And then, yes, if you generate income, gives you a further incentive to earn an income, to have some other special type of privileges. So I think it's the complementarity of the public health care, public education, and public sector generally with the private sector, which can be well exploited. And Brazil has exploited that well. Its growth rate, unfortunately, is much lower now. Last year was only 0.5%, I think, with Indians were deeply lamenting at the dismal picture of 6.2%. And I think there's something very odd. I think the thing to worry about is whether Indians delivered enough for the people, despite the favorable growth rate they happen to have. It's as and I think you and I, Tony, have agreed on that. Understanding the nature of a problem is halfway to solving it. And I think we ought to begin to understand. That's the great importance of a meeting like that going on in Jakarta, which I feel very deprived in not being able to be there because of my teaching commitment. But these kind of meetings are so enormously important in pinning down, nailing down the problem. And once the problem is clear, there's still an engagement about actions to reflect the understanding and to bring about the changes that are needed. But at least we are launched there. So conferences like in Jakarta, really extraordinarily important.